In this class, we will study the third main theory that we will consider concerning multinational companies, which is the evolutionary theory. So this is just to remind you what we did in the previous classes. We started from the product life cycle theory, in particular Vernon's approach. After the introduction of the sort of like the first approach to multinational company, that was Himmer, then we moved to the transaction cost approach, and in particular we studied one of its main application, which is, as I was saying, one of the theory that is most widely used nowadays, which is Dunning's framework, which uses part of the transaction cost approach to internalization. Today we make another step further and we study the evolutionary approach, and in similar ways to what we will adopt an approach which is similar to the one that we did in our class on transaction cost, because first I will give an introduction about evolutionary approach to the theory of the firm, which I think is useful because probably you don't know about that. At least this is what usually students from this course tell me. And then we will see how this approach can be applied to the transnational companies. And this application in particular was done first by an author whose name is Cantwell. And the Cantwell approach is also nowadays widely used. I could say, in a sense, that Dunning's approach and Cantwell approach are the two main approaches that nowadays are used to study and to explain the existence of transnational companies, and that are also used in empirical research to check what are the factors that actually drive multinational companies' decisions to invest in one place rather than in another. So the chapter of the book that deals with this theory is chapter 11 in my edition. Just check your edition, but it should be easy to find. And so in particular, what are the three main things that we will do? As I said, I will tell you some idea about the origins of the evolutionary approach to the theory of the firm, and the main origin is linked to the what is called the resource-based approach. Then we will see how, thanks to some author, we moved from the resource-based approach to the evolutionary approach, and then we will see how this is applied or can be applied to transnational companies. So let's start from the resource-based approach. Now, in the previous class, we started from Coase. I told you about this very important article that was written by Coase in 1937, The Nature of the Firm, where he argues basically that firms become an advantageous way of organizing production activities when transaction costs of detailed individual-to-individual trading, meaning the transaction cost associated with using the market system to coordinate our activities, are in excess of firm-based organization and employment contracts. Meaning, basically, as we know, when the transaction cost of using the market is larger than the transaction cost associated with organizing activities via managerial command. Okay, when this happens, it is more convenient to use a firm to organize activities, and a firm emerge. And the boundary of the firm extends up to the point in which an extra transaction via the market is more costly than internalizing that transaction within the firm. Now, Edith Penrose, which is an author that wrote an important book after Coase, in particular, he wrote this important book, which is called The Theory of the Growth of the Firm in 1959, sort of like define an approach which is somewhat of an alternative with respect to Coase, where his starting point is similar, because she thinks that the firm can be studied in a sense as an administrative unit. However, she argues that the firm is actually something more than just an administrative unit that deals with coordination via managerial command. Okay? It is also a collection of productive resources, the disposal of which between different users and over time is determined by administrative decision. So her idea from Penrose idea is basically that it is true that managerial command play a role within a firm. So she's not against this approach. However, she argues that there is something more than just managerial command and administrative decisions, because the best way of looking at the firm is actually not just as an administrative unit, but a collection of different types of resources. They can be physical resources, like machines. They can be human resources, like people. They can be sort of like organizational resources, like the way in which things are done within the firm, which of course depends also on administrative decisions, but there is something more there that needs to be considered in order to really grasp what a firm is actually doing. Okay, so her starting point is somewhat a sort of like unsatisfaction with the standard transaction cost approach. She wanted to add something more into the picture in order to study what the firm actually is. And one main point that Penrose considered, and that it is actually very interesting and has become very widely accepted and widely considered also as an important component of microeconomic analysis, even nowadays by more standard economists, is the fact that if cause was correct, meaning if the cost of organizing transactions it is the main thing that explains why firm exists, and also it's also the main factor that explains the size of the firm, you should expect that in a given sector, which has some characteristic, which may have some characteristic related to higher or lower asymmetric information, more or less traditional production and things like that, all the firms in that sector that produce similar products should be more or less of the same size in terms of the number of transactions that they internalize, because all these firms face the same degree of imperfection in the market and imperfection and therefore the same cost in using the market system to organize their production activities. So if the transaction cost approach was actually sufficient to explain why firm exist, you should observe that, of course, firm can have different sizes in different industries, because when there are more asymmetric information, probably the cost of using the market system is larger, and therefore you should expect firm of bigger size. But at the same time, in sectors in which asymmetric information are lower, the cost of using the market system is also lower. So in those cases, you should expect firms to be, all the firms in that sector to be of a smaller size. Okay. However, this is not what you observe in the data, because if you go to the data, you observe that even in very narrowly defined sectors, meaning even in sectors in which you can actually identify firms that produce more or less the same thing, the same product, you observe huge heterogeneity in the size of the firms. So even in narrowly defined sectors, you have very large firms that compete with very small ones in terms of number of people that they hire, in terms of sales. Doesn't matter the measure that you consider in order to identify the size of the firm. So this implies that we have huge within industry heterogeneity in the size of the firm, which cannot be explained by transaction cost approach. And just to give you an idea of this, I just used some data that I have to show you the distribution across sectors. So all the bars that you see in this graph are basically sectors, okay, 2-digit. It is, I mean, the definition of the sectors is at 2 digits, because you observe that there are 10, 11. So these are all manufacturing firms. So each column is a sector, and the column, the gray column that you observe is the share of multinational companies that operates in this sector. Why this is interesting? Well, because again, if you apply what I was saying before in terms of the size of the firm to our analysis of multinational companies, and you apply transaction cost economics to explain why multinational company exist, again, what matters is the extent to which a firm decides to internalize foreign production activities. Okay, and what is it that affects this decision? Well, again, the characteristics of the sectors in which the firm operates. If it is a sector with a large information asymmetries, you should expect that firms are more likely to internalize foreign production activities. So you should expect a multinational company to be there. Okay. On the contrary, in sectors in which you do not observe, in which information asymmetries are low, it means that using the market system is not very costly. So this implies that you should observe a multinational company not to be there, okay? Because the cost of using the market system is very small. So in this sense, you should observe, if you apply transaction cost economics, you should observe that in some sectors there are multinational companies, whereas in other sectors there is no multinational company. But this is not again what you observe in the data. If you go to the data, you observe that the share of course, the share of multinational company change. There are some sectors like the 19 and the 21, which I think is, I don't want to be wrong, but it's something related to chemicals production and things like that. There are more multinational companies, the share is higher, but still you do observe that in all the sectors, roughly more than 5% of the firm, or at least up to 5% of the firm, are multinational companies. Okay, so again, it is difficult to account for this heterogeneity in the distribution of multinational companies across sectors, or better, for the existence of multinational companies in nearly all sectors of the economy on the basis of the transaction cost approach. So what you need is something more, and this comes from the resource-based approach. Okay?